Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our virtual roundtable, Iran and China's Belt and Road Initiative between desirable and feasible. With this event, we initiate a new series, Regions and China's Belt and Road Initiative, co-hosted by two Harvard centers, David and Studies. The goal is to look at the ongoing transformations in geopolitics and governance, focusing on responses of different countries and regions to the political and economic dynamics affected by China's implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative. We decided to start our series with Iran, a country finding itself in most difficult geopolitical, geoeconomic circumstances and facing multiple domestic challenges. Over the past decades, the counterbalance pressures from the West, Iran has been more actively looking to the East and pursued stronger political and economic cooperation with China. Tehran is an enthusiastic supporter of the Belt and Road Initiative, hoping to benefit from Chinese investments, technologies, and new connectivity routes promoted under the BRI umbrella. This roundtable will discuss the prospects of Iran becoming a node of the BRI and the promises and challenges of Chinese investments in the Iranian economy. Let me give the floor to my partner in crime and colleague from the Fairbanks Center, James Evans.
Hi, everybody. And the Fairbanks Center and the Data Center are very pleased to bring this new series to everybody. Today, we have three excellent panelists who will bring their knowledge of China's foreign policy, Iran's economy, and Iran's foreign and security issues. Our first speaker today is Ike Freeman. He's a doctoral candidate at Balliol College at the University of Oxford. He holds an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Henry Scholar, and an AM in Asian Studies from Harvard University, where he also received his undergraduate AP degree. His research and commentary have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Economist, Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. And most recently, he is the author of One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World, which was a publication from Harvard Asia Center Press. Nader Habibi is the Henry J. Lear Professor of Practice in the Economics of the Middle East at Brandeis University's Crown Center for Middle East Studies. Before joining Brandeis University in 2007, he served as Managing Director of Economic Forecasting and Risk Analysis for Middle East and North Africa in Global Insight Limited. He earned his PhD in economics from Michigan State University, and his most recent research includes an analysis of the excess supply of college graduates in Middle Eastern countries, as well as the impact of economic sanctions on the Iranian economy and the impact of the Arab Spring uprising on economic conditions throughout the regions. Dina Esfandiari is a senior advisor in the Middle East and North Africa department of the International Crisis Group. Previously, she was a fellow at the Century Foundation, the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as well as previously working at King's College London and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She is the co-author of Triple Axis, Iran's Relations with Russia and China, as well as Living on the Edge, Iran and the Practice of Nuclear Hedging. She holds a PhD from the War Studies Department at King's College London, and master's degrees from King's College and the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva. We will have presentations from each of our three speakers. Afterwards, we will switch to a Q&A format. You can ask questions either in the Q&A function via Zoom or via YouTube, where we are currently live streaming. So Ike, I will hand it over to you as our first presenter.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Nargis, for the kind introduction and the opportunity to be on this terrific panel today. I'd like to share some of the findings of my own recent book, which is about One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative. I prefer the former nomenclature, both as a way of understanding how China sees the world, ideologically as well as financially and in terms of investment, and how this has played out in a number of case studies, Iran being one of 7 that I looked at in the book. Because I'm sharing the stage with two distinguished scholars of Iran, and I myself have training in China, I thought that I'd make this presentation sort of a 35,000 foot view of how China sees the issue, and make the case for why I believe that even though not very much has come substantively of Iran's engagement with One Belt, One Road, that I think brighter days are ahead. In other words, that it is sufficiently desirable that it will become more feasible over time. The United States has spent the last 12 years trying, with some success, to disengage from the Middle East. And as a result, regional powers, including Iran, but also including Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, have responded by seeking new allies and competing more fiercely with one another. Beyond the headlines, though, I think that China has been the single biggest winner of American retrenchment from the Middle East. And Iran's embrace of One Belt, One Road has something to tell us about that larger story. With the 10 minutes I have, I think I'll talk first about how China thinks about its long-term interests in the region, how the Belt and Road concept helps to advance them, how the implementation of the Belt and Road has been slightly different in the Middle East than in other regions, and then about how Iran fits into that regional picture. So let's stand back and consider the region from the vantage point of Beijing. China has been the largest buyer of Middle Eastern oil for over a decade now. And even under the most optimistic projections for China's green transition, Chinese demand for Middle Eastern oil will keep growing for at least another decade and probably remain above present levels for another decade after that. No country, even India, will come close to matching the scale of Chinese demand. So if you're China, you are quite concerned about the geopolitical stability of the region that supplies so much of your energy. And the status quo of geopolitics in the Middle East and the Western Indian Ocean is broadly favorable to China. Yes, Iran and Saudi Arabia squabble. Yes, there are civil wars and sectarian conflicts, but the oil flows freely, thanks in large part to the security guarantee provided by the United States and the United States Navy and the Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain. China has no interest in replacing this regional security order, just as the United States has no interest in being replaced. However, the fact that the United States has an antagonistic relationship with Iran, which includes sanctions, the fact that American demand for Middle Eastern oil is declining and is likely to decline further, and the fact that the United States has lost its appetite for interventionist foreign policy in the Middle East have all opened a strategic space for China to deepen and broaden its relationships with all of the regional powers, including Iran. China is thinking ahead. The PLA Navy is years and probably decades away from being able to project power in what China calls the far seas, the Yuanhai, which include the Persian Gulf. But Beijing is interested in the meantime in starting to lock in its presence in the region by investing in ports and port-adjacent economic zones. So we see examples of this in Gwadar in Pakistan, in Jusk in Iran, in Haifa in Israel, Duqm in Oman, and then of course there's the Chinese military base in Djibouti, which has been probably over-discussed, but is still significant as an indication of how important the geography of the region is to China. And meanwhile, China sees an opportunity to become a power broker of sorts in the region, the only outside power that has the political and economic influence over every single major country in the Middle East, including the three most powerful, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. In other words, Beijing's objective is to leverage its economic power for political benefit without getting caught in the region's tangled web of national and sectarian rivalries that has ensnared so many great powers before it, including the United States, the British, the French, and the Russians. So we can think about the Belt and Road in the Middle East as China's strategy for succeeding where its predecessors failed, for acquiring influence without entanglement. why does China see Iran as a desirable partner? The reasons are obvious. This is a cash-strapped, oil-rich state. It has no great power allies. It has a population of over 80 million, which means it has a large potential domestic market. And its geographic location offers excellent strategic access to the Strait of Hormuz. But Beijing also wants good relations with the Sunni Gulf states. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait use Huawei in their 5G networks. The UAE is vaccinating its population with Chinese COVID vaccines. And until recently, China cared far too much about keeping good relations with the United States than to gamble the whole relationship over Iran. So I think it is impossible to analyze Sino-Iranian détente and Iran's relationship with One Belt, One Road without this regional context, because this explains why the Belt and Road operates differently in the Middle East than in other regions. In Africa, in Central and Southeast Asia, in Europe, in Latin America, almost anywhere else you could name. When China launches a Belt and Road project, it almost always touts it. It touts it with media fanfare, with state visits and photo ops. And the Middle East is different in that Beijing has actively tried to keep its deals out of the headlines. Look no further to the strategic partnership, which was apparently announced between China and Iran, or agreed to between China and Iran as early as 2016, a $400 billion plan. And the only reason we know about it is because it was leaked. And the Belt and Road operates in similar ways, I should say, in the Sunni Gulf states. Very little has been written about how the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund is investing in Chinese AI companies that do facial recognition. This has a domestic surveillance component, and it is not played up in the press. And most of China's Belt and Road memoranda of understanding with Middle Eastern countries, not only Iran, are never released in full, in English and Chinese or in the local language. And that is not standard if you compare it to, say, Latin America or Southeast Asia. So the upshot of this is that China's tread lightly strategy is working. The list of countries in the region that have affiliated with the Belt and Road include not only Iran, but also Iraq, Egypt, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. This is extraordinary. These countries agree on almost nothing, but they all want closer ties with China under the aegis of this initiative. On the other hand, it serves to indicate the diplomatic tightrope that China is trying to walk. So this brings us to Iran and what the Belt and Road is actually doing there. I argue in my book that the Belt and Road inside Iran has been more of a slogan than an investment program. The two countries want closer relations for all of the reasons I've just outlined, but regional politics consistently gets in the way. The first instance of this was the lead up to the 2015 nuclear deal, when China backed all 4 UN Security Council resolutions to tighten sanctions on Iran, and made many big promises, most of which it failed to deliver upon. And then the next stage of this was when the proverbial chips were down, and the Trump administration began to aggressively enforce secondary sanctions, targeting the Chinese telecom giants, Huawei and ZTE, for doing business with Iran. And the response was a wide-scale pullout of Chinese enterprises from the country. Lenovo, the laptop country, shut down most of its operations. CNPC, the Chinese oil giant, began to pull out of its stake in the South Pars gas field. So it is surprising that the result of that, that those indications that in this wave of investment was not forthcoming, was followed by a wave of Iranian leaders continuing to embrace the Belt and Road slogan. And people like Foreign Minister Zarif writing in the Global Times about how great they thought this partnership could be. This, I think, indicates that Iranian officials and elites understand this is a buzzword to describe a form of long-term geopolitical alignment. It is not just a narrowly defined investment program that is measured in roads built or miles of railway constructed or billions of dollars spent. And one sign that this is expanding conceptually is that in the early stages of the pandemic, when Iran was hit hard, China sent shipments of PPE. So Belt and Road in Iran is clearly beneficial for both sides, clearly desirable. The question is it feasible? I'd say yes for 3 reasons. At least it is more feasible today than it has been ever before. Reason number 1 is that US-China relations have never been so toxic. While Beijing cares about keeping the relationship stable, it does not want to see Iran acquire a nuclear weapon. It is still far more willing to consider making geopolitical moves that antagonize the United States than it was 7 years ago. Reason number 2 is that the US disengagement from the Middle East has forced many regional powers to realign and to tolerate more from China. The fact that the Biden administration is giving the cold shoulder to Saudi Arabia is another reason why Sunni powers are beginning to seek accommodation with China. This means Beijing faces less risk of blowback. And reason number 3 is that China just has more to offer Iran than it did a decade ago. It has advanced a great deal in numerous sectors, and it now no longer offers just civil engineering expertise and funding. It offers high-tech products, services like vaccines, cloud computing, financial technology, and higher-end industrial equipment. In conclusion, I think for all of these reasons that the Belt and Road actually has a bright future in Iran. Yeah, you couldn't see that or measure it from anything that has been built to date, and things will continue to move slowly. But I believe that the logic for Sino-Iranian partnership remains very sound. I think this is a strategic problem for the United States. And if Washington continues its current policy, I think this alignment will seem more feasible with each passing year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ike. As a quick follow-up question, what do you see as the biggest sticking point between China and Iran in the future in that case?
American pressure and American sanctions.
That was a very quick answer, thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Habibi.
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to thank James and Narges for organizing this event. So I'm going to talk about 2 issues. First, I'm going to discuss the nature of Iran and China's economic relations. And then I will talk about the role of Iran in the BRI, the Belt and Road network that China is developing in Central Asia and Middle East. Ike really covered a good amount of issues about the key points of this relationship, but let me just point out that the economic relations between Iran and China have 2 dimensions. One of them is investment, where China is very interested in investing in Iran's oil and gas industry because it is the largest consumer of Iran's products. And to the extent that the US sanctions have allowed it, it has been eager to enter the Iranian oil and gas industry and invest. But those investments have been vulnerable to US sanctions and the United Nations sanctions periodically. The trade between 2 countries, partly because of the sanctions and Iran's isolation, have expanded rapidly. In 2014, the volume of trade was as high as $52 billion. But they are vulnerable to international sanctions because, as important as Iran is for China, the US-China economic and overall global relations are far more important. And China has repeatedly over these past 40 years demonstrated that it is not willing to cross the red line of compromising its interest with the US for sake of preserving them with Iran. So before the JCPOA nuclear agreement, China complied with the sanctions. After the agreement was reached, China-Iran economic relations grew rapidly. Many Chinese firms returned to Iran. And when Trump imposed this new round of maximum pressure sanctions, China retreated. To give you an example, in 2014, And Iran was exporting 750,000 barrels of oil to China. The official exports in late 2020, early 2021 was 75,000 barrels, almost 10%, which is a major reduction. Now, if we agree that there is some covert sales, clandestine ship-to-ship transfer sales to China, even that, to the best of estimates, comes to about 1/3 of what it was in 2014. Therefore, Iran-China relations are sensitive to the economic sanctions imposed on Iran and also to US-China relations. Now, let me talk about Iran's role in BRI. So Iran can play two roles in the Belt and Road Initiative. One of them is that it can become a consumer of products produced in the rest of the network of BRI as an end point and node. The second one is as a transit route, whether it has any value as a transit route. So clearly, as a large market, it has a value for all members of BRI. It is now cooperating with China, trading with Russia, and it's even indirectly and slowly participating in the Eurasian Economic Union, which is being merged with BRI because of cooperation between Russia and China. But does Iran have any transit value in BRI? You have to look at a number of factors to answer this. Iran does not have good relations with the Persian Gulf Arab countries, the GCC countries. Therefore, no country is likely to use it for transit to those countries. And countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE are reluctant to use Iran for transit to China or Central Asia. Furthermore, the development of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, if that is successful, which is currently underway, and if the port of Gwadar is developed as a efficient shipping center and a commercial port, then the GCC countries would prefer to trade with China through Gwadar, through the China-Pakistan corridor, which means they do not need Iran. So the second possibility is for Iran to be a transit route from China and Central Asia to Europe. This is possible. It is already, based on the development of the current network, underway. However, Turkey is also developing an alternative route to China. The recent success of Azerbaijan led to the development of a corridor between Azerbaijan and Armenian, and now Turkey is counting on that to be able to trade with the Central Asian countries, Turkmenistan, through a water passage on the Caspian Sea. So again, that has limited value. There is one other area that is left, which is Iran serving as a transit for trade between China and Central Asia and Iraq and Syria. So Iran is very interested in developing this. China itself has close economic ties with Iraq and is trying to expand relations with Syria. But we know that efforts to complete the transit routes between these three countries would be blocked by the United States for fear of these routes being used for transfer of weapons. And therefore, there is also a limited potential there, although I believe if the negotiations between Iran and the United States over sanctions are relatively successful and tensions diminish, both Iran and China are aggressively trying to create these transit routes with Iraq and through Iraq to Syria. Therefore, we have to keep that in mind as a potential benefit of Iran to the BRI network. Okay, now I'd like to add two more points as potential risks. First of all, there is a limit to how valuable Iran is for China in terms of uniquely developing ties with China. And as Ike mentioned, China has strong relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel. Therefore, it is not going to strategically significantly side with China, with Iran at the expense of relations with those two other countries. But another important point to keep in mind, yes, the Iranian regime is pro-China, and after the upcoming presidential election, when it is likely that a conservative will come to power in Iran as president, those ties might even be stronger. But you have to keep in mind that there is a growing anti-Chinese sentiment among some segments of Iranian population. It is partly because of this growing resentment of some segments of population towards the regime, and they identify China as somehow the backer of the regime, which means that if there is instability in Iran, or if there is any possibility of significant political or regime change, then China-Iran relations might undergo some kind of modification. I don't think in the long run they would diminish significantly, but we might see some disturbance in those relationships. To give you an example, in Iran, there was a brief period of shortage of electricity in the past few weeks. And suddenly, many people, both as opponents of the regime and critics inside the regime, started blaming China for the Bitcoin farms, the digital currency farms that Chinese had established in Iran. Now, the Poles and I believe another country, both of them, two other countries had developed this kind of what we call Bitcoin farmings, which require electricity. But none of those were blamed for this shortage. And there was no foundation for this because the amount of electricity consumed by these digital currency farms was only 1 to 1.5% of total production. Therefore, you can see that some people were just looking for opportunities to express anti-Chinese sentiments. We witnessed similar anti-Chinese sentiments from some quarters when the information about the Iran-China strategic cooperation agreement was leaked a few months back. So this has to be also taken into account. Let me to stop here and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Habibi. Dr. Esfandiary, let's go straight on to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and for for being on such a great panel with such other esteemed speakers. First, I guess I'm a little bit more ambivalent about the full feasibility of the implementation of BRI than Ike was. I think it will be difficult for some of the reasons that Nader has outlined and that I'll go into as well. I think the implementation, the way that it was spelled out is a little bit dicey, but I do think that compartmentalized relations between Iran and China will continue irrespective of what happens, pretty much, because they have an interest in tactical cooperation. So to reiterate something that Nader just said, I think it's really important to highlight that Iran's relationship with China and its view of China is very much set within the context of Iran's relations with the international community and, more importantly, with the US. So they have an interest in maintaining this relationship because they want to isolate the US's reach into their countries through sanctions, for example. They want to maintain the relationship they've managed to build between them has pragmatic, it's business oriented, it's non-ideological. And I think most importantly, it's compartmentalized. That means that if it doesn't advance in one sector, it will continue to advance in others. They are not, it's not like one issue will prevent it from flourishing in another area. So the economic won't necessarily impact the political, and the military won't necessarily impact the economic. And I think that goes a long way towards explaining the success of the continuation of this relationship. So from Iran's perspective, as Nader highlighted, there's a lot of suspicion They think that the Chinese goods and services are subpar, that the Chinese have been dragging their feet when it comes to delivering on investments in the country. The Chinese are seen as an unreliable partner. But of course, given everything that's happened with the US, given the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, given the debatable but somewhat failure of the JCPOA and its implementation, certainly from Iran's perspective, all of these notions of unreliability and of China being a pain rather than a useful partner really are being tested, because ultimately it turns out the Chinese deliver a lot better than everybody else has so far. So cooperation amongst the two has nonetheless persisted and strengthened despite the suspicions of the Iranians towards the Chinese. Iran has very much used China as a bulwark against being isolated by the US and by others. They don't function as an alliance or as a strategic partnership. It's more through a web of partnership, or even a compartmentalized web of partnerships, I think is the best way to describe it. And this desire that Iran has to build and maintain its relationship with China very much coincided with a growing China that was keen to get a sure footing in the Middle East. And of course, the BRI is a big component of that. So China has had, even throughout the period that Iran was isolated, China continued to have a presence in the Iranian market. That was a big advantage to it after the nuclear deal was agreed on. A lot of people often ask me, why is it that China and Russia were actually pursuing this deal? Because ultimately they were already in the Iranian market, so they didn't really need the sanctions relief that was being talked about in order for them to do what they wanted to do in Iran. This is true, but ultimately they participated, A, because they wanted to be seen as good non-proliferation actors, but also B, because ultimately they stood to gain anyway, because once the sanctions were lifted, what little barrier there was for them to engage thoroughly with Iran would have been lifted, and they would have been better placed than anybody else to do that, because they had been present on the Iranian market for like the last 20 years when the Europeans and the Americans weren't. So post JCPOA, there was an interesting phase where the Chinese were like, great, let's capitalize on the fact that these sanctions have been lifted to really strengthen our presence in the Iranian market, and also just to build a relationship that wasn't just economic, that was political, that was military. So it would have been wide ranging. But on the Iranian side, as Nader said, there was it was a little bit difficult, because there were a lot of people who were keen to kind of pivot west and reestablish some kind of relationship with the Europeans. So at the time, there were a lot of statements being made by different Iranian officials, including one from one of Iran's deputy oil ministers, that turned around and said, China has invested enough in Iran. It's time to provide opportunities and chances to other countries. And then there were those who were much more grounded in the Iranian system, who realized that Iran wouldn't ultimately be able to pivot away from China completely, not least of all because it's not like the Europeans and the Americans had shown, despite their willingness to engage Iran to come to a nuclear deal, they hadn't really shown anything beyond that. As was mentioned earlier, this post-JCPOA time was the beginning of this supposed strategic partnership between Iran and China. It kind of was launched when Xi went to Iran in January 2016, and there was this talk of expanding trade to 600 billion over the next dollars, I think, actually, over the next 10 years. And this was what was the big news when it was leaked last year, because nothing much of it had been leaked in 2016. So as the economic side of it has been largely covered, I'll talk a little bit about the political and the military and defense side of it. This supposed strategic partnership allows China to play a much bigger and a much more strategic role in the Middle East region. This coincides with China's the expansion of China's military-to-military exchanges with other countries and its expanded military presence globally. Iran very much fit into this plan. And it also coincides with Iran's desire to, or Iran's being on the lookout for new arms suppliers, because of course, at the time, Iran was waiting for the arms embargo to be lifted, which it was in October 2020, so just a few months ago. And so it was keen to start building a military relationship with countries that it knew would deal with it, because it realized that despite the fact that the JCPOA had been reached, the Europeans and the Americans weren't going to be first in line to sell it weapons. So, along with actually Russia as well, Iran, Russia, and China started carrying out joint naval exercises in the Indian Ocean and in the Gulf of Oman. I think that was in 2019. And there started to be more talk of military cooperation. Their military and defense ties were actually upgraded from 2016 onwards. So they were just, referred to as a more comprehensive military cooperation. They started cooperating on anti-terrorism, on cybercrime, on sharing, they were sharing intelligence. There was some cooperation between Iran and China in Syria, for example. And then there was all of this political support that Iran was getting from China that was also key. So Beijing supported Iran's application to the CSO. There was a great deal of support on the nuclear front, which was key for Iran. Keep in mind that in the back of Iran's head, this idea that it's been isolated for so long as a country, it's really important to be able to point to a huge superpower as a supporter, and China has been that supporter or partner or help for a long time now, along with Russia, because even throughout the discussions in the early 2000s with Iran, and then after the US sanctions in 2010, the Russians and the Chinese were largely still trying to defend the Iranians, either through their veto or at least by alleviating some of the sanctions that the Western world wanted to impose on Iran. So the benefit of the approach from Iran's perspective is that it's an apolitical, development-oriented approach that the Chinese has to the region. So it really uses Iran's regional power to expand economic relations with nearby countries. And China aims to establish security in the region through developmental peace, rather than what Iran sees as Western imposed democratic peace, which is a problem to it. It has significant influence, this relationship between Iran and China has had significant influence on the way things have changed or developed in the region. So for example, Iran has been able to shift some of its focus away from the Persian Gulf into the Gulf of Oman, which is something that it's wanted to do. And it continues to make US policy in the region and beyond, but concerning Iran, difficult. And like I said, for Iran, it's key. It's a massive political support at a time where it doesn't really have political support. So Iran is able to really use that and kind of point to it as, look, I'm not an isolated state. But as Nadra mentioned, it is a relationship that remains problematic internally in Iran. Iran realizes it doesn't have that much of a choice, although I guess now that the Trump administration era is kind of over, it feels like maybe it can get somewhere with the Europeans and the Americans now. There is this history of distrust and the lack of Chinese, caring about the countries that it invests in. While it's a positive because it means that it won't ask anything of Iran, it's also a negative because it means that if it's not in China's interest, it won't have Iran's back. So it remains a problematic relationship internally in Iran, but it's undeniable that it has brought Iran many security, political, military dividends, and it will continue to do so as long as the relationship remains tactical, compartmentalized, and really beneficial to both sides. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. We've covered a lot of ground. Let me take it further by posing the first set of questions. The question for Ike is, in your book, you discuss these relations that China is developing with other countries under the BRI umbrella as a revival of the tributary system. What's the place and role of a country like Iran in this system? So sort of a very bird view question. For Nader, in your excellent article, first, I was very happy you talked about different corridors, and we do see a competition of corridors that are developed under the BRI label. And in your article that you published a year ago in The Diplomat, you talk about the Iranian interest in linking Chabahar port to Gwadar by highway and natural gas pipeline, which is a very, very interesting development. What are the prospects of these plans? And the second question has to do with your comment on anti-Chinese sentiments, and Dina already also talked about it. What are the kind of the main fears and concerns of the Iranian public? Personally, I was surprised by an article I saw in Tehran Times saying that, that Zarif made a statement that Iran won't give an inch of its soil to China. That's the discourse that is common in Central Asia, where I'm from. Yeah. So what are the concerns? What are the fears of the Iranian public? And questions to Dina. You talked about the upgrading of military security relations between China and Iran, and it seems from that leaked draft comprehensive partnership agreement, like 25-year agreement that became public last year. There are plans to further upgrade this cooperation, sharing intelligence, and also joint research and weapons development. Can you comment on that? And also, can you comment on the import of Chinese surveillance tech to Iran that is becoming a big issue, and its impact on domestic politics in Iran? Let's start in the same order that we did the initial remarks. Can I ask you to start?
Of course, and thank you, Nargis, for citing my book. So in the book, I argue that One Belt, One Road is several different things wrapped up into one, and we need to be careful when we speak about it to clarify what aspect we're actually talking about. One aspect is the physical infrastructure that is being built around the world under the aegis of the Belt and Road slogan. Nader cited several of these examples, these trade corridors crisscrossing Central Asia. There has been extensive quantitative work mapping them and trying to understand how they link up. As I understand it, having dug into the details, there isn't very much there. That is, first of all, most of these trade corridors crossing Central Asia, particularly the overland ones, are not actually carrying a significant amount of throughput. Most global trade is conducted in these enormous vessels, and sea freight is always going to be cheaper per unit by weight than overland freight. So we should think about the Belt and Road less as a network of physical infrastructure than as a night sky with many disconnected dots. But I think separately, it's important to understand that Belt and Road has an ideological or political component, which exists in parallel to, but kind of separate from, the infrastructure being built. In my book, I look at how the Chinese government has tried to communicate to its own people what the Belt and Road is, what it's trying to accomplish. And that has entailed not only the predictable kinds of propaganda, but actually the wholesale rewriting of history books. So it turns out that the history of the ancient Silk Road in the official Communist Party historiography has been rejiggered and some fundamental facts rewritten in order to bring the ancient version of the Silk Road in parallel to what Xi Jinping is trying to do. And I think that the best way to understand this in a phrase is a neo-tributary system. The tributary system is a contested, sort of semi-mythic idea of how imperial China, particularly in the Ming and Qing dynasties, used to interact with countries on its periphery. And notionally, those smaller, weaker countries on the Chinese periphery would send envoys who would kowtow, prostrate themselves before the emperor. There would be a ritualistic exchange of gifts and political favors, and they would come away with the emperor's approval to rule back at home. And I believe that at least within China, this is essentially how the Belt and Road has been communicated. Look at what Xi Jinping is doing to restore the grandeur and the lost glory of the imperial Chinese court, that all of these foreigners will make the trek to Beijing to bid or seen as being begging for Chinese money and Chinese investment. I think that the relationship between China and Iran, and this is my last point here, is slightly different because Iran also identifies as a Silk Road power. It has a long, obviously, the Persian Empire was for thousands of years, in many ways, a cultural equal to the Chinese Empire, and the two had numerous interactions that I describe in the book and considered each other to be peers. So this is a historical heritage that both sides have cited in the course of negotiating a Belt and Road relationship. You can argue that this is symbolism or rhetoric, it doesn't mean anything, but definitely there is notionally an idea of the two as co-equal civilizations who have been wronged by colonialism and the rise of the West, particularly the imperialist British and Americans, and that the two have in a sense a common interest in reviving an alternative geopolitical order to the one dominated by the United States. Now, you can argue that that's just rhetoric and it doesn't mean much, but certainly this has domestic salience, certainly in China, and I presume in the United States, because it would seem to legitimize what the regime is doing at home.
Okay.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first one is about the China-Pakistan economic corridor and the linkage to Iran. When that corridor was being developed, Iran was negotiating with India to develop Iran's Chabahar port for what we call north-south transit, so that India can trade with Russia and Central Asia. However, in response to US economic sanctions, India refused to take the steps forward, even though an agreement was signed. So Iran waited for several years. And finally, last year, it gave up on India doing anything, and it decided to approach China to see if the Chabahar port, which is about, I think, 120 kilometers from Gwadar, to be linked to Gwadar. If we solve the logistic issues, it could be a valuable link, an additional linkage, both for China to send goods to Iran and through Iran perhaps northward, and for Iran to trade and even sell natural gas to China through Pakistan, where obviously China is a major customer. There are two challenges. One is that there is considerable political violence in Balochistan, where these two, in both sides of the border, especially in Pakistan, which might pose a challenge. And the second issue is that the development of the oil pipes, gas pipes, and the transit routes inside Pakistan is not yet complete, and that is underway. So if those two challenges are resolved, it can be a valuable linkage by itself. Although there are many centers for China to trade with, so there might be some element of redundancy throughout the region with these multiple ports that are being developed. The second question is about anti-Chinese sentiments. With respect to ordinary people who are not supporters of the regime, I think these negative perceptions of China are somewhat exaggerated because of the association between regime and the China, people perceiving China as the backer of the regime. And Iran has a historical precedence for that because there was a very strong anti-American sentiment in the years ahead of the Islamic Revolution. But now that people look back, many people have different opinions about the true nature of American-Iranian relations during the Pahlavi regime. There is exaggeration about the negative aspects of Chinese relations with Iran, in my opinion, from the people who are opposed, both opposition outside and the domestic Iranians. But for example, the announcement of the $400 billion strategic agreement, people started reading too much into it, that this will include compromise of Iran's sovereignty, both in economic and territorial aspects, which was not true. China has signed similar deals with many other countries. It is not even a free trade agreement where both sides reduce tariffs on each other. It is just a vision of how they would like to push forward over a long period of time. Yet, if you look at the media and the reaction, it was highly exaggerated. Therefore, I think it is something to be considered as a risk factor, but those are the main concerns. Within the regime also, there are some people who for technical reasons are concerned, and some because of the factional disputes within the regime that again, they might look at this as a political point between between those competing factions. There is some healthy criticism of the nature of relations that I think should be there, and it's relevant. For example, the price at which Iran sells its oil should be scrutinized. If there was transparency, it is ideal. But I think some of it is exaggerated because of political sentiments.
All right, I'll go ahead. I think that the relationship, the military and security relationship, can expand in a range of areas, and they have indicated a willingness to expand in a range of areas. I think that for things like intelligence sharing, they showed that they were able to do it in arenas like Syria, and so I think there's going to be a real desire to expand on that. The things that I mentioned earlier, the cooperation that's been going on so far for combating terrorism and cybercrime and stuff like that, I think those are the very easy areas for them to expand their cooperation in. There will be greater coordination, that they have made it very clear. So I would anticipate more joint military and naval exercises of like the type that we saw last year. Also because it's a good way for them to pose a threat in an arena that is still one where the US is present and remains a concern to the US. So I think that's definitely something that they'll be pursuing. The one thing that's going to be problematic, and again, very much dependent on how China-US relations kind of unfold in the next little while, will be the provision and the sale of weapons to Iran. When the arms embargo was lifted in October of last year, Iran kept pointing to that date, like this is going to be the date where we're going to be able to buy everything that we want to buy on the market, and everyone's just going to sell it onto us, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, none of that came. There are talks with the Russians and the Chinese, but no one's really rushing to sell weapon systems to the Iranians, and that's where I think it's a real clear example of this relationship being dependent on each of these countries' relationships with the U.S. And I don't think anyone's going to make a move until, like a significant move at least, until it becomes clear how, what U.S. policy is going to be in the next little while. In terms of the surveillance of the provision of surveillance technologies, I think where that has the biggest impact domestically is on people that are opposed to the regime. So it goes directly into what Nader was saying. The perception is that the Chinese are here to help the Iranian regime strengthen its grip on the country and strengthen its control of the Iranian population. And when news like this gets out, it doesn't help that perception in any way, and it very, very much worsens the distaste that the people that oppose the regime have for the Chinese have. That gets worse. I think that that's really where it plays the most domestically.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, the event is co-organized by the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, so we can't leave with Russia out of it. And you, Dina, mentioned Russia. What is the role of Russia in all this? Well, Nader, you mentioned North-South corridor, and that's the something that Russia was interested in as a way of softly counterbalancing this East-West Silk Road economic belt fostered by China. So does Russia play a role? Who wants to chip in? Okay, Dina, yes.
I'll start quickly because I can provide a big overview. So the way that Russia kind of fills into the equation is that the three countries, and I guess this will go a little bit against what Ike was saying, so I'm happy to debate this further if you want. I think the way that the three countries work is that they do see themselves as thinking in the same way about the way the international system works. So yes, they're against the international system. They want to undermine the current order, but I actually don't think that they want to replace it. They want to undermine it from within it. They want to use its institutions to undermine it. But they don't want the responsibility of an alternative world order, because that's a huge responsibility that they can't be bothered to deal with. But they do want to undermine US power. They do want to undermine the current order. And that's, in that respect, that's how Russia fits in. I think that it has, in some areas, it competes with China. In other areas, it doesn't really care about what China does in Iran. In other areas, it works in tandem with China. And again, the military drills is an example of that. And this really is proof, again, of the compartmentalization of these relationships. I often mirror the Iran-China relationship with the Iran-Russia relationship. I can't talk much about the Russia-China relationship because that's not my area of expertise, but it really is similar. The idea is we work together when we need to. We ignore each other when we need to. We ignore the problems we have with one another when we need to. As long as we can get what we want done, then the stuff that we can't get done, we'll just shove aside and leave it aside. And I think that's how that dynamic works.
I fully agree, but there is one thing. One power is on the rise, another one is in decline, which is creating this kind of interesting dynamic. Nader, yes?
Yes, I think with both of them, Iran's relations are not long-term strategic, but somewhat transactional, and especially with Russia. Russia and China both have good relations with the Iranian regime, but they're not competing in the same markets. Russia provides more of a heavy infrastructure and sort of military cooperation. China is focused on more on economic aspects of it. But again, Russia, similar to China, does not have a privileged relation with Iran. Russia is also very close to Israel and Saudi Arabia. And even when Russia and Iran cooperate in Syria, Russia does not stop the Israelis from attacking Iranian targets. So that's why I believe it is transactional. Russia and China do not coordinate their policy towards Iran, although they both support Iran, except for certain aspects of the nuclear negotiations where they seem to have had some coordination against the US position.
Thank you very much. Ike, do you want to say something?
I would simply note, jumping off a point that Dina made earlier, if I'm the United States, there are few things that I would find more concerning than Iran, Russia, and China doing joint naval exercises. That's a sign of coordination in the security domain, right in the middle of the Indo-Pacific near some very important sea lanes. And I think it's telling that having conducted those exercises altogether 2 years ago, China called in sick to the events that were supposed to be held last week, the drills, and They claimed it was the Chinese New Year, so they couldn't make it. I would not be surprised if there was some other story that we may or may not learn down the road for why they didn't go. But if I were the Biden administration, this would be a very high priority, as I was thinking about keeping One Belt, One Road from consolidating into a geopolitical bloc, is driving wedges in between these three powers to make sure they don't cooperate on issues that would affect my interests.
Excellent. And well, James, please.
Sure. Thank you, everybody. We are wrapping up there as we have hit our time. I'd like to thank our panelists, Mike Raymond, Nader Habibi, and Dina Esfandiari, my co-moderator, Nargis Casanova, and our audience for some excellent questions that we managed to ask. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions for time purposes. I'd like to thank the Davis Center for not only co-sponsoring, but also providing logistic support for today's event. This event will live on YouTube after, so if you did not manage to see all of it or you'd like to watch it again, it will be available. I'd also like to thank our two other co-sponsors, the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies here at Harvard University. This lecture series will continue later this semester, so stay tuned from both the Fairbanks Center and the Davis Center to hear announcements about future events. So many thanks to you all.